Hello and welcome. Today we're going to begin the final section of Paul's letter to the Philippians. We're in verse 10 of chapter 4. And before I get into that, I want to start by, kind of going over some of the background of this letter, which is especially pertinent based upon the things that Paul says in this last section. If you remember, Paul's imprisoned in Rome. He's being charged with sedition or rebellion against the state. And if he's found guilty, he will be executed by decapitation. The end of the story is that Paul is acquitted. 2 years later, he's rearrested after Rome burns, and the Emperor Nero uses the Christians, and Paul and Peter in particular, as examples of those who have been responsible for the fire, and he has them executed. But at this time, Paul is a prisoner in Rome, and one of the things about being a prisoner in Rome was that your state of comfort was directly proportionate to what you could afford. I mean, Rome would provide you with a cell, they would provide you with bread and butter, or bread and water, but that was about it. If you had money and you could rent your own home or live in your own home, you might have a guard and you might be chained to that guard, but you were able to live at whatever standard you were able to afford. So whatever food you could afford to abide, whatever servants you could afford to have around you, all those things were directly related to, they're kind of like a Mexican prison today. Basically, if you can afford it, you can live pretty comfortably. And so what the church in Philippi did was they sent a man by the name of Epaphroditus. He's probably one of the pastors or leaders of the church in Philippi. And they sent him to Rome, particularly with a sum of money to help support Paul in his imprisonment. And so Paul later on sends Epaphroditus back with this letter to the Philippians. And in this closing section, Paul begins to address the financial gift that they had given to him. And he's want to let them know that he's extremely thankful for it and appreciates it, but he is really more moved by what that gift represented, because it represented a huge sacrifice on the part of the Philippians, who themselves were struggling under persecution and hardship, and they were willing to sacrifice above and beyond what they could actually afford, Paul tells us as he later writes to the Corinthians. But he also said that it just showed that they hadn't forgotten about him. And that's why it reads a little strange to us the way he puts it translates it in verse 10, where it says, "I rejoice greatly in the Lord that at last you have renewed your concern for me. Indeed, you have been concerned, but you had no opportunity to show it." This is a fairly literal, exact translation of what the original says. And sometimes a very literal translation doesn't help us get a better picture. It can make it a little bit more difficult to understand. And the phrasing here is a little bit different. I mean, it's a little awkward to our way of thinking. We think in our languages, and each language has a different way of thinking, and so we express things in different ways. I like the way that William Barclay, in his commentary, translated or rendered this particular verse, and it seems more sensible to me, where he says, Paul's writing, "I rejoiced greatly in the Lord that now at length," in other words, now after a long time of not hearing anything from you or about your situation, "you have made your thoughtfulness for me to blossom again." Well, admittedly, it's a lot more poetic, but he's simply saying, it's like watching the flowers come up. I mean, every spring my wife and I wait to see the flowers begin to bloom and blossom and fill our yard with color because it's beautiful. And Paul's saying, that I've gone through this dry period, wondering how you're doing, wondering if you're doing well or whether you're suffering. And this gift and the visit of Epaphroditus has refreshed my heart, refreshed my soul, and I just am blossoming again because I see that your love for me has blossomed and that you haven't forgot about me. I think it hits on a real issue, and that's the issue of what we might call thoughtfulness on one hand and loneliness on the other. Thoughtfulness means that we carry somebody's welfare and concern and our love for them and care for them in our minds all the time. So that it doesn't matter where I'm in the world. I've traveled all around the world, and yet I don't go through any day without thinking about my wife and my family and how they're doing and hoping that they're well. And I try to communicate regularly so they'll know how I'm doing and how I feel, because we care about what's going on in each other's life. That kind of concern is vitally important, and it's something that many people are not feeling in this day and age. In fact, we sometimes hear people say things like, well, I don't care what other people think. And that's really not only true, but it's also a sign of something very unhealthy. We should care about what other people think, and we do care about what other people think, because whether we want to admit it or not, we need other people. I know you're going to tell me about the guy that you saw on the Learning Channel who's a recluse living in the mountains of Alaska or something like that and doesn't see any other. And we even have a whole TV show called Alone where people try to live by themselves alone. But the reason it's interesting to us, if it is to you, actually I've never watched it, but the reason it would be interesting to us is because we like to understand, how does somebody live alone? I mean, how do you do that where you have other people not only depend on for your material and physical needs and safety, but just to have companionship? That's why the natural desire of everybody is to get married, to have a husband or a wife, and to have children. As a friend of mine put it really well one time, he said that when my wife and I got married, we found such pleasure in our relationship that one day it occurred to us, how much richer would it be if we could have children and we could expand that love to even more people and make that family grow so that we could reciprocate and reproduce that kind of love and caring. That's part of what we call human nourishing. And yet today we're facing a situation where instead of finding flourishing and nourishing, we find people who are withering and dying, quite literally, from what we call an epidemic of loneliness. And certainly this was heightened because of COVID and the masking and the lockdowns, which, if for no other reason, we probably killed more people through those efforts than we did through the actual epidemic or fodemic or whatever you want to call it. But the reality is, being alone is a deadly circumstance. In fact, in a 2018 report put out by the Kaiser Family Foundation, they found that over 1/5 of people living in the United States, about 60 million people, said they often or always, that's interesting, often or always felt lonely or socially isolated. So you look at 20% of the population is living a life of lonely misery. They have no one they can talk to, no one ever interacts with them, or very little interaction whatsoever. It reminds me of an elderly gentleman who was going to his barber once a week to get his hair cut, and the barber knew he didn't have a lot of money. He said, it's really not necessary to get a haircut every week. And the elderly gentleman said, well, I don't come here to get my hair cut. He said, when I come here, it's the only time I feel the touch of another human being, and so it's worth it to me. And you realize what that is a statement of loneliness, that we need to be looked at, we need to be noticed, we need to be heard, we need to be touched, caressed, loved, hugged. For years I was not a big hugger. I mean, I didn't go around just hugging people spontaneously. And I don't condemn that at all, because I've come to learn to appreciate the people who do that. But the simple fact, I realize that there's a lot of people who just never have anybody just put an arm around their shoulder and saying, how are you doing? And to pray for them and care for them. And it's that thoughtfulness that we find is really missing today. It's a problem that's growing and increasing, if not because of the fodemic that we just went through, but also because we have become people that spend increasingly large amounts of time looking at screens. I call it digital tyranny. And in a way, the whole digital system is designed to capture your gaze and hold you looking at the camera. Or at the screen and watching the show and other things. They continually seek to keep you there. They don't want you to turn it off. They don't want you to stop searching. They want you to stay connected to the internet or to the television or whatever screen you're looking at. And it's amazing, because what we even go so far as to create faux relationships through social media. I mean, we have people that they like us and they're our friends on our social media. And basically, if one day we didn't show up or didn't respond, they wouldn't notice, because you're really just one of 900 to 1,000 other people. The truth of the matter is that nobody can really know more than 40 or 50 people. No one can really be close friends with more than 2 or 3. And you find that there are people in this world who don't have 2 or 3. My father-in-law is 99 years of age, and everybody he knew has passed away a long time ago. And that's what he's facing. I talk to him every other day. My wife calls him every other day, and some of the other family members call him even more often than that. Because what he does is he sits in his apartment by himself, and he's alone. And he has trouble even finding people that he can interact with. And if you talk to him, he'll tell you the hardest part, and the thing that makes him want to give up on life, is the fact that he is incredibly lonely. So I'll leave it at that because I'm out of time. But tomorrow, if you don't mind, I'd just like to continue the conversation about this issue of loneliness and how it interacts with what Paul was talking about earlier about the anxiety and the lack of peace in our life. So until then, stay posted and I'll be back with you, Lord willing.